Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thanks for listening. My name is Bret Keisling, and as it says on my business cards, I'm a passionate advocate for employee ownership. We have a great episode in store for you today, and it's just a little bit different than our normal episodes. We'll have a company origin story. Happens to be the company that was the very first certified B Corp in the world. There's some other interesting things. It's a great story. It's the kind of story we tell all the time, except it's not an employee-owned story. But it was so similar that I wanted to bring my guest on, who is the retired CEO of UnTours. And he's going to tell us all about the company and its origin story and its trek to B Corporation status. Brian Taussig-Lux is with us. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here, Bret.
So I want to give a shout out to our mutual friend, Daniel Goldstein, who is just an absolute lion in employee ownership. He's a great advocate. He was a great CEO of Foliance for many years. But you and Daniel were in graduate school together a couple of decades ago. And Daniel put you and I in touch with each other and said, Bret, Brian's got a story. And oh my goodness, you certainly do. So I want to just start off by thanking Daniel for putting us in touch together.
Yeah. Daniel and I go way back, and he's a good friend and quite a business person, and apparently quite a leader in the ESOP community, which I'm very pleased to hear.
He absolutely is, and it's very much within his character that he would put us in touch and just say, hey, you guys should talk. He brings people together, and he always does it in the support of the employee ownership community. So Brian, I love the story of your company. You and I have chatted a couple of times. You've got a great story, a great origin story, your personal connection to it. And we all know that there's a relationship, a symbiotic relationship between employee-owned companies and certified B corporations, in that the vibe, wanting to do better for the right reasons, seems to be involved in both. So if you can, tell us a little bit about UnTours. What we're going to do, Brian, is talk about UnTours, hear the origin story and your connection to it. We want to talk a little bit about the foundation that owns UnTours, which is a very interesting, fascinating component. And of course, how you got into the certified B Corp status as the very first one. So if that's okay with you, I'm going to let you take it away and start with, tell us how UnTours came to be.
Okay, great. So UnTours was started by my uncle, Hal Taussig, who, along with my father, grew up on a cattle ranch in Colorado. At some point, he and my father, being young men and wanting to start out on their own, decided to start their own ranch in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. And they found a great piece of land along the Blue River, and they managed to buy a bull that was a prize-winning bull with a great pedigree. The only problem, as they found out a few months later, was that the bull was sterile. And that had been the bulk of their investment in this ranch. And that pretty much ended their very short venture as cattle ranchers in Colorado.
As I'm sure you're aware, Brian, some of our country and world's greatest entrepreneurs started off with failures, quite frankly. And the fact that they got a sterile bull in charge of siring is certainly I'm glad it didn't set the tone for the rest of your uncle's business career.
Well, it didn't. Although he did like to joke that that was the first of several failures that he experienced on his way to creating UnTours. After that, my uncle went east and went to college and went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania and got a PhD in American Studies, which set him on an academic course, which took him to a small college in Kentucky, a Catholic college in Kentucky. And now we're in the 60s, late 60s. We've got the Vietnam War going. We've got a lot of tumult happening in society at large. He got involved with an anti-Vietnam War group and was protesting the war. He was also involved in, I think, what they were calling curriculum reform, which was something happening in academia at the time, that all of which led to the sisters who ran the college coming to the point of deciding that he really wasn't a good fit anymore and not renewing his contract. So he did not stay at the college for very long. However, while he was there, he did take a sabbatical in Europe. And learned a lot. He was there for about 6 months, I believe, with his daughter and with his wife, and they traveled all over and learned some really important techniques on living cheaply, living inexpensively, but at the same time, really getting a deeper view of European culture and living closer to the ground, if you will. That was the time when the norm for European travel, for Americans at least, was if it's Tuesday, it must be Belgium. The bus tour, you get on in one city, you go for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, and just city to city to city, it's just a whirlwind. Those tours still exist to some degree, but that's not the way a lot of Americans travel anymore.
It was very evocative when you said, Tuesday it must be Belgium and when you got home, you called the neighbors over for a slideshow.
Exactly.
Very much the vibe. Absolutely.
Exactly. You remember it well. Yeah, those were the days. So in lieu of a slideshow, my uncle actually wrote a book called Shoestring Sabbatical, thinking this could, he discovered a lot of ways to travel cheaply, and especially for academics, that was a significant part of what they were thinking about. So he wrote this book, and it did not sell. It was not a success. So he liked to joke that that was maybe his third failure. You had the sterile bull, you had the college, and you had the book. So at some point, though, along the way, he became someone that people went to get travel advice. His friends knew that he'd traveled and knew Europe pretty well. And they started coming to him, asking him questions. And that really sparked the idea that, hey, maybe there's a business here. So that's when in 1975, he and his wife started UnTours. They started it out of their little apartment, and it was a lot of work and didn't go well right at first, but Hal was just tireless in calling travel editors of newspapers around the country, and he struck gold with a particular travel editor at the Los Angeles Times who just thought Hal was an amazing character, really interesting guy, and this business concept that he was talking about was something really unique and interesting. So Jerry Hulse of the Los Angeles Times did several front page travel section full feature articles about UnTours that really jump-started the company and launched it to the success that it later became.
Brian, can you share for a little bit, what was the business model for UnTours? Like what differentiated UnTours from different travel agencies of the time?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the sort of dominant mode of European travel at the time, what Hal decided that Americans really could and should do is, number one, stay longer in one place, right? Rather than just bopping around from one place to the other, stay longer in one place, get to know a place very well, and really have a deeper experience. At the time, the minimum length of stay for UnTours was 3 weeks, which just seems incredibly long. Even today, it seems very, very long. And you were staying in an apartment, a vacation apartment, or a vacation rental, as we call them now. We were the first company really to popularize staying in European apartments for Americans. That was just not a thing. People were staying in hotels. And the other part of it was that we provided local support. So we met the clients at the airport, brought them by train down to the villages where they were staying. And again, they were staying in villages, not in cities. And then we would give them an orientation the day after they arrived, just giving them lots of information about what to see, how to see it. And then they would travel, in this case, around Switzerland with a rail pass and a little booklet on what we thought they should see. And they were really independent for 3 weeks. If they ran into trouble, there was a number to call. And we told them how to use the cell phones, which is the only way to reach us. I'm not the cell phones, the phone booths, as we remember. And so people knew how to reach us in the case of trouble. And that's really the way that they traveled. So they really had the best of both worlds. They were independent travelers, but they had local support.
Probably a vibe where it almost felt like they had taken up residence there for 3 weeks, that
exactly.
it's completely different from staying in a hotel.
Exactly, exactly. They'd go grocery shopping, they'd go to the bakery, the butcher. A lot of people became very friendly with the bakers, especially because they were there sometimes every day getting those fresh croissants, those fresh rolls. And they became part of the community. And the locals started noticing and were very friendly and realized, hey, these folks are a good part of our local economy. They're staying around, they're getting to know us. And it really fostered a lot of cross-cultural communication that was kind of new at the time. There weren't that many American tourists doing this kind of traveling at the time. And by the way, that model is still the model for UnTours. It's now a 1 week minimum that you stay in an apartment in Europe, but we still have the same kind of apartments with local support, ground transportation, lots of information on what to do and see. So that's still the model for UnTours, and that was started back in 1975.
Hey, Brian, forgive me. I meant to mention at the top of the episode, I did share that you had retired from UnTours in 2023. But just to throw in the overly cautious disclaimer, people should be aware you're not speaking for UnTours, you're not speaking for the UnTours Foundation, and further, you're not speaking for, when we get to it, the Certified B Corporation group that does those great designations. So I just wanted to, as you mentioned, it's still what UnTours does today. I just wanted to mention that you're just speaking here for yourself.
Thank you, Brett. That's something I should have said earlier, but that's very true. I'm no longer affiliated with UnTours, and I'm not affiliated with B Corp. I'm speaking just as Brian today.
As your reminiscence, and
That's right.
I appreciate it. So you started building this business model where people could stay. It sounds absolutely wonderful. Did your uncle find success?
Yes, absolutely. He found success, and the company began to grow. He began to hire. His wife was his first hire. She quit her job and began working with Hal, and the company began to grow. Early on, though, Hal ran into an unexpected problem. He was making too much money, which sounds strange. That's a hard thing for anybody to imagine who's begun a business, but he was not comfortable with making so much money. Just going back a little bit, during his period of unemployment after he was laid off from his job at the college in Kentucky, they struggled a little bit, he and his wife. His wife got a job and she was working, they had an apartment, they were not hungry or anything, they weren't poor, but they were living very simply, and they had to live simply, and he realized that he actually liked living that way. And during that period, he decided that he would take what he called later, somewhat jokingly, but it was also pretty serious for him, a vow of poverty. He would often joke that, he couldn't really become a monk because he would never be able to take a vow of obedience or chastity, but he could certainly take a vow of poverty, and that was as far as he could take it. Part of his reason for doing that was that he really wanted to live in solidarity with people who had less than he did. And he felt that this was a way of doing that. And so what he did after that initial success at UnTours is he actually sent refund checks to his clients who traveled with him in that year. I don't know what that might have been 1977, but he basically sent them a letter apologizing for charging too much along with a check. And people were alternately horrified and delighted to receive this letter. Folks were delighted. Many people were delighted and decided this is the guy. They're going to travel with him as long as they can because he's just an unbelievable businessman and he's going to keep prices down and he has their interests in mind. Other people said, this guy's nuts. I can't travel with him again. But as Hal liked to say, everyone cashed the check.
And just to let you know, Brian, first of all, I think I agree with both of them. I love the vibe, and that shows how the company and you yourself perhaps got to where you are today, that underlying vibe. But to be clear, he's not saying he overcharged in the sense that there was something unscrupulous or people paid more than they should have. These people gladly paid for the service, presumably were generally happy customers, and his only metric was he felt he had made too much money.
Exactly. The way he set his prices at the time was he said, okay, these are my costs, and this is how much I need to live on. And so he would just add what he thought he needed to live on in aggregate to those costs, and that was the way he set his margins. And that year, because he sold so many trips, he exceeded what he needed to live on, and for him, that meant that he miscalculated. he'd made a mistake, and he was that's the way he explained it in his letter to his clients.
Well,
So
bless his heart. I mean, it says a lot positive about him, but yeah, I'd be in the category of, yeah, not in favor of refunding happy customers across the board, but good for him. Now, you were a kid when it started. How did you get involved with the company?
right. So I got involved when I was 18. Actually, when I was 17, my uncle asked if I'd like to come and work with him in Switzerland after graduation. And so obviously I was very excited about that. That was something that was a unique opportunity. And I lived in California in a little town, and I was very eager to see the world. So when that offer came along, I jumped at the chance. So I spent a summer in Switzerland working, and what I was doing was things like carrying luggage for people. I was writing local festivals that were going on during the period that people would be there. Remember, people were there for 3 weeks at the time, so we had a very, very busy few days at the beginning of that 3 week period, and then people would settle into their routines and they'd be traveling off on their own, and I wasn't really needed to man the phone, so to speak, in Switzerland. There were other people who were doing that and servicing clients during that period. So I would go all over Europe using a rail pass. I got a Eurail pass and would travel all over the continent, really, getting to know Europe. But I also just got to know the way this business worked, and I loved it. I just really got to love the way this business worked, loved the idea of travel, really started getting my uncle and what he was all about and his unconventional ways of running a business and viewing travel. And at the end of the summer, he asked if I wanted to work for him. At the time, I had other plans and said, no, thanks. I've got other plans. I'm going to become an engineer. But long story short, a couple of years later, I was on a flight to Philadelphia from San Francisco. And that started my career at UnTours. So I started in 1983 at UnTours. And it was an interesting time at the company because Hal, after that initial refund that he sent clients, his employees at the time were not too thrilled with his decision to do that, as you can imagine.
I imagine.
Right. And they said, look, if you have a problem of having too much money again, why don't you talk to us? We can help you with that problem. Why don't you just, give us a little bonus here or something? And so he said, yeah, okay, I get it. Again, he was always kind of dabbling in socialist ideas. He never really liked socialism or communism at all, but he liked some of the ideas of sharing wealth with workers and all of that. So he said, look, I get it. So let's do this. He said, let's split the pot evenly. At the end of the year, we'll look at how much profit there is, and we'll divide it evenly, and I'll take the same share as you, and my wife will take the same share as everybody else. So the two of them, Hal and Norma, owners of the company, they shared equally with all of these employees who were not owners. So it was really moving in the direction of sort of almost a worker-owned kind of business without the workers actually having the ownership. They were sharing the profits from the very beginning.
But it's that vibe we see in employee ownership. And there's all kinds, Brian, and our listeners will get this. There are any number of times when I was an ESOP trustee where I helped create brand new ESOPs, where you'd walk into a company and there is a vibe of well-functioning employee-owned companies. And certainly the coolest thing was walking into a business that is considering or starting the process to becoming an ESOP, and you can tell they've already got an employee ownership vibe. For example, when the CEO of a 400 employee factory goes out, takes us on the factory floor for a tour, and every employee was greeted by name, that's the kind of vibe, of an employee-owned company. So your uncle sharing the profits very much fits into with what we love to see. And I like it much better than refunding the customers. Not that I get a bonus.
Yeah, it actually worked pretty well for a number of years, and I came during that period when employees were happy and really feeling like they had a stake in this now. They were very, very aware of the profitability of the company and the importance of selling and running the company efficiently. All of that was very, very top of mind for everybody that worked there. So I came during that period. Another thing that he was doing at the time was experimenting with what he was calling democratic management, where we would have meetings to make policy decisions, and these would get pretty heated at times. Sometimes he would even lose a vote. He would strive for consensus, but when he couldn't get consensus, he would accept the result of a majority vote. And there were a couple of times, not often, when he actually got outvoted and had to sort of, in his mind, had to live with whatever decision that the employees made. And those were interesting times. Everybody knew this was really unusual, really cutting edge. Well, cutting edge maybe isn't the word, but it was definitely unusual. And we were part of a really interesting experiment at UnTours. It did become a little problematic, though, as the company grew, as time went on, and we had to hire new people. You can imagine that someone who's been at a company for a number of years being paid exactly the same as somebody who's just walked through the door as a new employee and is being trained by that employee with seniority, that created some friction and some resentment. And Hal was not really interested in starting to pay people based on seniority. He really believed that everyone should get exactly the same salary, exactly the same bonus. And that was really the way he wanted to do it. So that became more and more of a problem, along with increasing difficulty with this somewhat unwieldy democratic management that he'd put in place. Things finally reached a head, and he said, okay, we're going to do things differently now. I'm going to take a new approach to my problem of making too much money. Rather than sharing it with employees the way I've been doing it, I'm going to create a foundation that's going to address poverty in a more direct way. He hadn't really been doing this employee bonus sharing, profit sharing as a way of addressing poverty, but poverty was always a big issue for him that he had a lot of passion about. And so he created this foundation called the UnTours Foundation. And what he decided to do with it was to do micro lending to folks in impoverished communities who didn't have access to capital, who wanted to start businesses or grow their existing businesses. So he was really offering capital to folks who couldn't get it any other way. Banks would not touch this kind of client, and these were high risk investments. But he was charging very low interest rates, right around inflation or a little bit above the inflation level. So that was the concept, and it really started succeeding. So essentially what he did was all the profits that the company made, he just donated directly to his foundation. There were two entities, and the money flowed through him as an individual, but that was the way he was funding this foundation. And in the meantime, he started paying market salaries to his employees, and there was still profit sharing, but it was at a much more modest level. And since his main goal was really funneling as much of the profits as possible through to this charitable foundation. So that was his next approach to the problem of success and too much profit, excess profits, as he sometimes called it.
And all of this is in the context of the businesses continuing to grow and be successful, et cetera.
That's right. That's right. So I came in 1983, and in 1992, when the foundation was established, I was actually on my way out. I went off to graduate school to pursue a different career. I went to business school. That's where I met Daniel Goldstein. And
with no intention of returning to UnTours.
No, that was not at all my intent. I'd been there 9 years. That was plenty of time. I kind of learned everything I could learn, and there was really no need to stick around. But at some point after graduation, after working at a couple of jobs in upstate New York, he managed to convince me to come back. They were having some issues on the profitability side, and he really wanted to get some help. So he asked me to come back with my freshly minted MBA to try to help turn the company around and move things forward, which I did, thinking, okay, I'll stick around for a couple of years, and then go off and do my thing again in a different field, which happened to be my interest at the time was environmental issues, environmental management, renewable energy, things like that. That was my interest in the direction I was hoping to go. But I turned out that I really loved working for my uncle. He was a great boss, and he was just an irresistible personality and someone that all of us just loved being around. And so I stuck with it for 27 years. But that was an exciting time. we managed to increase profits by doing some restructuring and looking at margins and making some changes on that front. And profits really started flowing into the foundation. And that was something that caught the attention in 1999 of Paul Newman and John F. Kennedy Jr., who, unbeknownst to us, had been looking across the country at various companies that they considered to be inordinately generous. And so in 1999, they awarded Hal and UnTours the award for being the most generous company in America. And so we had
That is so cool. That is just quite a cool honor, not the least of which because it's Paul Newman and JFK Jr.
Yeah, it was really cool. We were very proud and really surprised by the honor, but because we weren't giving away more money than than large corporations that have corporate philanthropy, but as a percentage of what Hal was making, he was giving away pretty much 100% of the profits that were coming into the company were going directly to the foundation. He was living by that point on Social Security. He and his wife were living on Social Security. He was putting all the profit, just donating everything. He wasn't even taking a salary at the time. That became another issue later when the IRS discovered that he wasn't taking a salary, and we had to pay a few fines and get him on salary. But he was just giving it all away. The IRS didn't care that he was giving it all away. They still said, no, you got to take a salary.
Which is still refreshing compared to all of the CEOs who are normally taken down for the IRS for excessive salary,
Exactly.
or reporting it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's still a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a lot of fun, and I was lucky enough to go up to New York to the awards ceremony with Hal and with his wife, and that was a fun time. So those were some good days, and another person who came onto the scene a little bit later, but as kind of as a result of a lot of this attention that Hal was getting, was a man named J. Cohen Gilbert. So Hal had joined a group of socially conscious entrepreneurs in Philadelphia called the Sustainable Business Network, SBN, that still exists, but it was fairly new at the time. It was still, at the time, fairly unusual for people to be running businesses and also thinking about the social and environmental impacts of their business. And Hal was doing that. I was bringing the environmental perspective to it as well. So we were really conscious about how we were making these profits. It wasn't just let's generate as much as we can and not really care how we're making it. We were very, very conscious of that. And Hal met some really interesting business people at these meetings, including J. Cohen Gilbert, who at the time had started a very, very successful sneaker company, basketball shoe company called And One. And he was getting close to exiting the business and was looking for his next gig. And he saw Hal and just saw someone who just embodied the values that Jay just really, really respected. Not only was he all about social and environmental issues and really running his business according to his values, but he was living his values. I mean, the idea that he was just living on so little money and giving everything away really was inspiring to Jay. And that was something that helped Jay, in his telling, reach a point where he wanted to do something to really build a community of like-minded businesses. So Jay and Hal started getting together, having some meetings, and just getting together for beer. And I came along to some of those early meetings at our little brew pub down the street here in Media. And we had some great conversations. I remember at one point we went out to see Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist and Nobel-winning economist. He gave a talk locally, and we all went out to see him. But we had some really good conversations early on. And by 2006, I got to meet another guy that had been working with Jay for a long time at And One, and was also getting close to to this exit that I talked about that Jay was looking at, Bart Houlihan. And Bart, I was recommended by Jay as someone that could help me with a particularly thorny financial problem I'd been grappling with and wasn't really able to solve. And Bart came in and was able to dig into it. And within 6 months or so, he'd come up with some great recommendations and pinpointed the problem. And I was very impressed. But during that period, we were having some great conversations about social entrepreneurship and the theories behind it, the impulses behind it. We talked a lot about scale. Can this reach scale? Can large companies follow these same kinds of guidelines? We were really having some great talks. And so by 2007, Jay and Bart came to us and said, look, we've got a concept that we really think we can run with here, and we'd love to have you guys be part of it. And that was the point at which Hal said, hey, can we be first? And said, yeah, of course, you guys definitely need to be first with this. And that was when the concept of an assessment came into being, and a certification that would cover lots of environmental and social criteria.
Brian, if you were to distill for us, being a certified B Corp means X. Like,
yeah,
is it shorthand to describe it?
Yeah, well, I'm sure there is a shorthand, and I can't give you the elevator pitch that I used to, but essentially it's a third-party certification that you are walking the talk. You might be talking about all these great environmental things you're doing, or these great social things you're doing, or how great you are for your employees, but until some third party comes in and says, yeah, this company's actually doing what they say they're doing, who can believe you? I mean, there's so much greenwashing out there. There's so much lying out there. It's all marketing and spin. It's hard to sort through what's real and what's not real and in the past decade or so, it's gotten even harder just with all the fake news out there. But that's really what B Lab decided that they could help with. There were a few certifications at the time, but none of them were nearly as broad or nearly as rigorous as what B Lab was proposing to do. So that's essentially, in a nutshell, what they're doing. They're looking at 5 different areas. They're looking at governance, workers, community, environment, and even customers. So on the governance side, they're looking at lots of things, but one example would be, how diverse is your board? Do you have any outside board members, or is everybody a family member? Things like that can really make a difference with in terms of profitability too. But certainly these are ways to improve a company's social performance.
Brian, let me just throw out for our listeners in employee ownership. It is not unusual when a company, particularly on the smaller side, is converting to employee ownership. This is when they're introduced to the concept of independent outside board directors. This is when they're perhaps hearing for the first time that, no, the board can't entirely be your family anymore. And the diversity of it and the word has taken on a different meaning in the last couple of years with DEI, which I personally, and we don't have to delve into there, think is very important. But diversity in the 2007, 2008 period was still historically, you should get a banker, you should get a marketing person, diversity of jobs, not necessarily how people looked back then.
That's right. That's right. And at UnTours, we were pretty proud. That was an area that we consistently excelled in. It was our governance, the diversity of our board was really what drove our high scores on governance. And so we got to brag a little bit about being extremely good on governance, just because we had some really smart people who happened to be diverse,
right.
And were bringing great perspective to our board. Yeah. So governance is one area. Workers is another. Workers, and you can imagine that focuses a lot on things like pay and equity and benefits and things that you would expect to see. And also, as it turns out, things that for us were kind of a given. We knew that we needed to treat our employees well in order to have them treat our customers well. And so for us, it was just good business. And that was not an area that we struggled too much with. Governance was kind of new to us, those issues were new to us. And I'm jumping ahead past the point where we're certified at this point. We can come back and look more at how we got there. But the third area is community. And for us, community meant a lot, had a lot to do with volunteer hours. So we were giving our employees a certain number of volunteer days per year that they'd be paid for, and they could go out and volunteer in the community. And we had been doing that prior to this anyway, but now we began tracking those community hours and reporting them when we had our assessments. So that was part of the community. There are a lot of other things that go into community, but that was a big one. Environment, that's one that we had been paying close attention to for a number of years. The two biggies for us were paper use. We mailed out hundreds of thousands of catalogs every year. Well, maybe not 100, maybe a couple 100,000 catalogs a year. And we needed to be mindful about what kind of paper we were using and that sort of thing. We wanted to use the forest certified papers and post-consumer waste recycled papers, et cetera. We also were very mindful of our carbon footprint. So for many years, we had been buying carbon offsets to offset our business operations in Media, Pennsylvania. That was something that, again, for us, this was a no-brainer. We needed to do this as part of our commitment, running a company that we considered sustainable. These issues were not quite the same as how we were treating our employees, which for us was just good business. It helped the bottom line. It helped us actually become more profitable, having employees, having low turnover and having really dedicated employees who were happy to work for us. These environmental issues were a little different in that there was no ROI necessarily on using more expensive paper or paying to reduce our carbon footprint. We weren't getting the ROI directly. These were benefits that were accruing to society at large as opposed to accruing to us and our bottom line directly.
And with the type of work that you do, I believe when we spoke previously, we're talking about paper for 150,000 catalogs in a print run. This was a significant part of your marketing budget that you're forced with the business decision of, do we do this? Is the certification that important to us? Is it that critical? But certainly there were competing pressures with some of those decisions.
That's right. That's right. And we were making these decisions even before becoming B certified. And in some ways, this B certification made it easier for us to do this because it made it easier for us to justify doing this. We were now part of a community of like-minded business people who were all held to a higher standard. And this really made it in many ways easier to make these decisions. These dilemmas were sometimes difficult. Even after the certification, we'd say, okay, well, how far do we want to push this? Do we want to go for the absolute cleanest paper that we're going to pay 70% more for, or do we want to go for paper that we're going to pay 50% more for? These were the sorts of decisions that we were making, but the certification definitely helped make some of this stuff a little bit easier, even though they weren't traditional business decisions that were going to accrue to our bottom line. So finally, the fifth area that the B certification looks at is customers. They want to make sure that you're providing a really good product. You're not lying about your product. You're selling what you say you're going to be selling. If you're a B2B business, they want to see that you are actually help your customer reduce their environmental impact or their social impact or improve their social impact. So that's another part of this. In that regard, supply chain is a big part of what they encourage you to look at and really force you in some ways to look at. And that was something we'd never really looked at before. We hadn't looked in depth at the companies that we were buying from as part of our own environmental and social impact. But that we found to be a very interesting and very fruitful area for improvement. And we ended up changing some suppliers and making some decisions to help with the certification, but also to help us feel like we were running a more sustainable business. There's another aspect to being a B Corp that I haven't mentioned that's actually fairly important. I don't know if you've heard, Brett, about the term benefit corporation, but that's something that came about from the onset of B corporations. So early on, B Lab, the nonprofit that certifies B corporations, ran into a little bit of a problem in that if a company had multiple owners, the company could, or the management of the company could get into trouble if they were not prioritizing profits over every other consideration. And you can imagine how if that's a problem, if that's going to block a company's management from taking steps to improve its sustainability and its social performance, then they had to address that problem. They actually addressed that problem in a really interesting way. They created this new concept of a benefit corporation. So a company can voluntarily opt into taking into consideration its social and environmental performance, as well as its monetary profitability as part of its business mission. And that was a state-by-state effort that was really led by the folks over at B Lab, who hired a very, very smart, very attorney, very good guy to go around and work with state legislatures to pass this progressive legislation. And now that is, as far as I know, that's probably still a requirement of being a B corporation, is that you have to also be a benefit corporation. If your state offers that status, you also have to be a benefit corporation, which, of course, if there's a sale of the business, that becomes part of the DNA of the company, and that, in theory, would need to continue that ability for management to look at factors beyond monetary profitability.
I was aware of benefit corporations. They don't come up a whole lot, but again, it certainly fits in with the vibe of what many employee-owned companies are trying to do. But had no clue at all of the connection between the certified B Corps and the benefit corporation. So that's an interesting little tidbit. There was our friend Daniel Goldstein that we talked about, spoke at the Employee Ownership Ideas Forum this week in Washington, D.C. Daniel was last week's guest on the podcast. And there was one of the panelists, I don't believe it was on Daniel's panel, but has a pretty big sized company, and they chose to be an employee ownership trust rather than an ESOP. And when someone from the audience said, why did you choose an EOT, which is a perfectly fine way to go, instead of being an ESOP, his answer surprised me because it was just so stark. As an ESOP, there was always a risk that somebody would come along and offer enough money that the trustee and the company would have to sell. And I'm a former trustee, Brian. There is a dollar amount that any company, I'd be like, yeah, we got no choice. Whereas with the employee ownership trust, they can write in, as you said, hardwire into the DNA that this company can never be sold. It must always in perpetuity be an employee ownership trust. Now, I assume you can, at some point go through a process to change the trust provisions, et cetera, and never say never. But generally speaking, it's very interesting that those companies that take that much to heart of what their DNA is are going to rather strong legal protections to keep that DNA intact moving forward.
That's right. That's right. And just as an aside, you can be a company can become a benefit corporation without being a B certified corporation, if you know what I mean.
Correct.
So you can register with the state and become a benefit corporation. One of the requirements is that you have to give an annual report, send it in our case to Harrisburg, and that's something that we were doing annually. But I don't think, and again, I don't speak for B Corporation, but I don't think you can be a B Corporation, a certified B Corporation, without being a benefit corporation, if that's available in the state where you're registered.
If they have that. But you made a very important distinction, which is it is just when a business is normally when it's initiated, although you can switch the structure down the road, but that's where you go to the state, and you register either as an S Corp, a C Corp, an LLC, a limited partnership, even a fictitious name if you're acting as a sole proprietor. So the benefit corporation is an additional add-on to those categories that you
That's right.
Election when you do that. Well, that's very interesting. So once you are certified, can you just chat a little bit? Is there a recertification process? Is it a lifetime designation? How does that work? Does B Labs come back?
Yeah, they do. And again, I need to be careful, but I believe the recertification might happen right now about every 4 years or so. It could be more frequent. It might, but it's every certain number of years you have to be recertified. It's certainly not a lifetime certification. It's a rigorous process. And it even for a company like us that had been doing a lot of this stuff for a long time, it was hard. There's a minimum number of points that you need to achieve. So you get points for doing various things. And if you don't reach that threshold of points, you don't become B certified. Now, once you get above that threshold, it's all gravy, and if you get a high score, you get to brag about that. But for us, it was just, can we get over this hurdle to become certified? Initially, when we did it, it was there was no certification for, I think, about 6 months after we did it. But we got to go through the very earliest certification all the way through to the last one that we did was in 2022, I believe. And so it's done about every 4 years. It's a rigorous, difficult process. Yeah, on top of that, there is an audit, a random audit that can occur that you can go through, and you're selected randomly. And we did get selected one year, and that was even more difficult than the certification in many ways, because even though they do ask for a lot of documentation during the regular certification, they ask for even more during the audit. But it is a bit of a spot check, the audit. They're really going to check certain areas and ask for deeper and more documentation with that. So they are really serious. They're not playing games. They are really serious about it. They're friendly and helpful and help you work through the process. But if you don't pass, you don't pass. And that's a big part of why this is a meaningful certification.
That is really fascinating, and it shows the commitment that the company must have to wanting the certification to subject themselves. And we will, Brian, on the show notes for this episode, we will include links to B Lab, and as we've said now several times, you're not speaking for anybody, but we'll also include a link to the UnTours Foundation and UnTours, where people can check out the websites as well, but you're here just doing reflections over your career. But we'll include a link to B Labs and the Certified B Corps that if people more curious, they can go get a better handle from their own websites. So are there any Certified B Corps that our listeners might know of, businesses, popular culture?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some big companies. Body Shop is one, Patagonia, Kickstarter, Allbirds, the kind of shoes that I just happen to really like. Ben & Jerry's is an interesting case.
Interesting case.
Yeah, I think, and again, I don't quote me on this, but I think that they might have been the first public company, because they were part of Groupe Danone, and I think still are technically, but I think they're being spun off at some point in the near future. But as a brand of a public company, they still managed to become certified. That was, I think, a unique situation, but one that shows the flexibility of the B certification and the ambition of B Lab to really certify companies of all types, including public companies. And I believe that there are at least one B certified company that is a public company right now. I couldn't tell you which one it is, but they are very interested in beginning a very broad certification that can apply to companies of all types. But those are some marquee companies that I think a lot of your listeners might have heard of.
Are you familiar with any ESOPs who are certified B Corps?
Yeah, two come to mind. Well, one ESOP comes to mind, and that's King Arthur Baking. They were a founding B Corporation. It looks like they actually were certified along with us back in 2007.
Wow, that's very cool.
So they go way back, and they're 100% ESOP. They're, I think, a really important company in that space.
And they are, first of all, they're a very important company in the flour and baking space, in terms of what they do. They are as good as it gets. They are legendary in the ESOP community. For the vibe, that we talk about, the worker satisfaction, the job retention, the community service, and everybody, and even, to a great extent, a lot of people who work there feeling democratization of the workplace. They have a say in what's going on. And so King Arthur is just hats off to them. That's great. And it's cool that they were founding Certified B Corps along with you guys. And did you mention a second one?
It's a company that's actually a co-op that's a B corporation, and that's Namaste Solar in Boulder, Colorado.
Sure.
I actually met one of the founders of the company at a B Champions retreat. The B corporations have annual retreats, and Boulder, Colorado was flooded at some point right around the time of our retreat, and Namaste Solar was just literally digging mud out of its offices, and they asked us to come over and help, and we went over and did a lot of mud digging over at their office in Boulder.
That is very cool. And Brian, what I like, and I want to be careful how I say this, Namaste Solar is very highly regarded. They do an absolutely great job and really seem to have the employee ownership vibe in an industry that is not necessarily well regarded for consumer protection, or, there are certainly a number of solar companies that give the rest of them a bad name. And to me, I think it's absolutely brilliant that what a great way to separate themselves from their competitors, more so than perhaps for some businesses, than, hey, we're certified B Corp, this is what it means, and talk about giving a comfort level to their potential customers. I think that's great.
Yeah, me too. They're great people, and yeah, that B certification really does give you, as a consumer, even the assurance that you're buying a product that's going to be a good product. If you're a B corporation, you can't be certified if you're selling a product that's not good. And so that's definitely a consideration as a consumer. If you're buying solar panels or shoes or anything, you see that B label, it means something.
I love that. So Brian, is with an eye towards wrapping up, and I appreciate this conversation. I've enjoyed it very much. Give us the lay of the land now. You have since retired, but why don't you give us a look at the modern, so to speak, UnTours and UnTours Foundation?
Sure. So after Hal and Norma's death, the corporation UnTours, the company UnTours, was inherited, if you will, by the foundation. So the UnTours Foundation now owns this profit-making company UnTours, and this is part of the way that they fund their own work is through the profits of UnTours. So there are, at least when I left, there were two boards. There was a board for the corporation and there was a board for the foundation, and the foundation board appointed the board for the corporation. And the work of the foundation continues. They're very active. They're doing really good work. They're continuing with the micro lending that we talked about earlier. They've also got some new work that they're doing that's been led. By the way, my colleague Elizabeth Killow has led the foundation for many, many years. She worked with my uncle early on and has led it since his death, and now shares leadership with Jonathan Coleman, the new co-CEO of the foundation. The two of them are a great team. Elizabeth, I've worked with for many, many years. She has worked with foundations on aligning their investments with the work that they do. And that's a really important new work that the foundation has taken on in the meantime. So they're doing great work. I encourage your listeners to take a look at the foundation and as a model for what foundations can do with their assets, and also for the kind of model of owning a B corporation and having a foundation own a corporation. All of these things are unique and interesting and might be interesting to your listeners.
I love that. And when I first heard that the UnTours Foundation owns UnTours, I thought, being in central Pennsylvania, a lot of people don't realize the Hershey Corporation, those of the Hershey Brewers and the Hershey Kisses, is actually owned by a foundation, and billions of dollars of profits go into the Milton Hershey School, which is for troubled kids in one form or another, oftentimes with both parents or at least one parent deceased, and which I believe is if I'm not mistaken, the wealthiest nonprofit in the United States, and it's all driven from the profits of this corporation. And Hershey and its the Hershey Trust Company came to mind when I heard the UnTours Foundation. It is very much that setup and that vibe. And although your Uncle Hal does not have the household reach that Milton Hershey does, it certainly seems like as entrepreneurs, they had the similar vibe of they had vision, they executed the vision, and probably ignored a lot of naysayers along the way.
That's right. And it's been really great to be associated with the company and the foundation for all these years.
Well, I love that. And you spent your career there, so it's so important that you have satisfaction. I appreciate your taking us through the company's history, the origins. I love the origin story, and how you came to be the first of the certified B Corps, which I think is just a fascinating tidbit. So what are you doing now, post-retirement? You're just kicking back, you're not doing a darn thing, making podcast appearances, or you got other plans in the works?
Well, I've been working on starting a small travel company called Taussig Travel. I've been in the industry for 36 years. I love to travel myself. And during the bulk of that 36 years I was as CEO, I wasn't exactly on the front lines working with customers and helping them plan their trips, but every once in a while I'd have a chance to talk to a customer, and I enjoyed that interaction and just helping folks have a great time in Europe. And so I decided, hey, let me just get back to that for a minute and help people focus on Europe and travel in Europe. So I've teamed up with a former colleague of mine, Patty, who's run her own travel agency for 30 plus years and has deep experience in Europe and with the luxury market, which includes things like destination weddings and stuff like that. But between the two of us, we can really help people with any trip to Europe that you can imagine. And a couple of things that I enjoy talking about are things that are a little off the beaten track. We could help people with river cruises in Europe, but we could also help with these little barge cruises through Burgundy on a little barge that might have 3 cabins, and you get to experience local wines and eat in local restaurants, local gourmet restaurants, and take little trips every day off to castles and villages and things like that. Maybe even bicycle alongside the barge. That's a fun kind of trip. Seeing the Greek islands on a small yacht, pulling up to ports that big ships can't even think about approaching. Those are fun things. I love walking. My wife and I have done some walking in Spain and England, and I think walking tours are something that I could help people with. But also, I'm still interested in sustainability and talking to folks about the sustainability aspects of their trip, reducing their impact and looking at local community impacts in a positive way, and also reducing carbon impacts. I'd like to talk with folks about all of that. At the same time, having a great vacation, but also doing it in a mindful way. Those are the kinds of things I'm looking forward to doing.
I love that. And I hope as your business gets up and operating and more in place when you have a website, et cetera, that you'll come back on and just keep us posted. And I'm daydreaming now of an employee ownership related trip to Europe that you can facilitate, and me and a bunch of listeners would go. That would be the ultimate and really cool thing for me to see happen. Brian, I appreciate your time, the time you spent with me getting ready to do the recording. That means a lot. And I do hope people will check out the show notes for the various links. But UnTours has a fascinating history. Your uncle certainly seems like an interesting guy, but kudos to you. People don't understand that the next generation of a family business is not always a slam dunk to keep the business operating. And the fact that you guys were able to grow and expand, and then, we really didn't talk about it, but make it through COVID, which could not have been more devastating to the travel industry, and to be back on the upswing is just a testament to what your uncle started and what you and your colleagues continued.
Yeah, that's right. And like I said, it was great to have the privilege of being able to lead the company through those times. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story.
Thanks, Bret. It's been fun talking to you.
With that, we'll wrap up this episode of the podcast. My thanks again to Brian Taussig-Lux, to Daniel Goldstein for introducing Brian and I, and of course to you, the listener. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at ESOP Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.